Welcome to today's personal pondering in the Psalms. And before we look at today's Psalm, I want to ask you a very personal question. How much do you desire God? How much do you long for God? Today's Psalm, Psalm 63, is all about David's intense, deep longing for God. Reminds me a little bit of Psalm 42, paraphrased in the song, "As the deer pants for the water." This isn't just a casual desire for God. It's a desire that is a life or death emotion. Just as that wild animal in the parched desert needs the water to survive, so David needs his God to survive. Psalm 63 is intensely personal, and the context makes the content even more striking. We're told at the beginning of the psalm that it's written by David when he was in the wilderness of Judah. Now, David was often in the wilderness. Sometimes he was on the run from Saul, other times he was on the run from his own son Absalom. And it's this second situation, I think, that applies here, and we can be pretty sure about that because at the end of the psalm, in verse 11, David refers to himself as the king. Now, he wasn't the king when Saul was chasing him, but he was the king when Absalom mounted his insurrection against him. So this is David the king, back in the desert, on the run for his life. But his focus is not on the danger that he's in. His focus is on his desire for God. I've divided the psalm up very briefly into three sections: 1 to 4, 5 to 8, and 9 to 11. And there's some overlap here, but 1 to 4 speaks about the past, 5 to 8 speaks about the present, and 9 to 11 looks forward to the future. But let's just look at these very briefly. First of all, in verses 1 to 4, David looks back on the past and he remembers times when he was there in the sanctuary, in the tabernacle, in the place of worship of God. And I have looked upon you in the sanctuary, he says in verse 2, beholding your power and your glory. And as he remembers those days, now in the wilderness, cut off from all those spiritually life-giving opportunities, my soul thirsts for you, he says. My flesh faints for you, as in a dry and weary land where there is no water. This man is in dire straits, but his hunger and his desire for God seems to know no bounds. And it's striking because he's in a desert, but his soul is not in a desert place. Yes, he's in desperate need, but his spiritual life has not become dry and arid. If anything, it's been intensified by the uncomfortable surroundings in which he finds himself. And if you're unsure just how much David desires to know more and more of his God, just look at verse 3. Your steadfast love is better than life. In other words, David's saying, if it's a choice between living and loving you, I'll go for loving you any day. Because this life will come and go. This life is brief and fragile. But the steadfast love, the chesed love of God, is beyond all price. That's how much David desires God as he reflects on the past. How does that affect him in the present? Verses 5 to 8. Well, in his loneliness, on the run, he lies on his bed and remembers all these past experiences. He meditates on God, verse 6, in the watches of the night, because he remembers all the ways God has blessed him and met with him and helped him in days past. Now here's another very strong statement in verse 8. My soul clings to you. It's the old English translation of cleave. It's exactly the same word here that's used in Genesis 2. So a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. Cleave to, cling to his wife. The two will become so close that you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. It's the two becoming one. And David says, my soul clings to God. What an intense, deep relationship. This is not a casual churchgoer. This is not a casual religious person who's in it for what God can do for him. This is a man who desires God above all else simply because of who God is. So the past, the present, and then the future. David looks with confidence the future. He knows what is the future for his enemies. They will go down into the depths of the earth and be given over to the power of the sword. But he also knows his own future. He will not die in the desert. He will not be overcome by Absalom and his forces or any of his other enemies. The king shall rejoice in God, and all who swear by him shall exult, for the mouths of liars will be stopped. Because David has the guarantee from God of his own kingship, and that Absalom will not be able to destroy or depose him. I don't know what your circumstances are at this moment or at any other time in your life, but it's often in the dry desert parts of our lives our relationship with God is tested most. And God takes us into the desert very often in order to test our desire for him. You alone are my strength, my shield. For you alone may my spirit yield, says the songwriter in the paraphrase of Psalm 42. And David says, give me you above all else available to me, even life itself. May God so deepen and intensify our desire for him that it becomes an all-consuming passion, that we will reject and sideline everything that might come in the way. And then we'll know real fellowship with him. The Lord bless you.